Hi, class. So we're going to be talking a little bit about World War One and how it affected the United States on the American home front. So how did it affect us here at home? So with the United States entering the war, the United States pulled out all the stops to try to get the United States to get Americans into the war and support the war and to shut down any dissent to prevent people from, disagreeing with it, right? They wanted everyone to support it. So on the home front, progressives, which had seen a lot of change, they just saw this as this entry into the war as a chance to reform America from the top to the bottom and to spread their progressive values worldwide. And this was widely supported by many intellectuals and reformers at the time. So what this meant was that the government's powers were widely expanded to increase support for the war. The selective service, or the draft, was introduced for the first time since the Civil War, and 24 million men were required to register for it. The government got involved in regulating industry, agriculture, railroads, and even labor relations to try and produce everything that the country needed for the war effort. During this time, the government is going to greatly expand its power over the economy. Actually, President Wilson had direct control over many aspects of the economy, and he helped to create many agencies to force contributions to the United States military effort. And this led to many collaborations between businesses and the government. Wilson, he had groups like the War Industries Board, the Railroad Administration, the Fuel Administration, and the Food Administration that regulated what businesses and farmers could do and making sure that they contributed to the war effort. So, because of this, the US economy is going to see massive growth, and corporations in these fields are going to see their profits soar. Union membership is also going to greatly increase. Remember, we learned about labor unions a couple units back. So, union membership is also going to increase. And at the same time, you're going to have a lot of strikes. Over 6,000 strikes by union members protesting working conditions and also pay because they wanted their share of these increasing profits that American corporations were seeing during the war. There was also a lot of back and forth over civil liberties. You had victory loans and liberty loans that were sold to raise money for the war effort and to increase public support for the war. So they would have parades and rallies to get people to donate to the war effort. We also had groups like the Committee on Public Information. That was a government organization that created propaganda supporting the war effort. And this also reflected this growing anti immigrant and particularly anti German sentiment in the United States. For instance, German language, music, and food were banned. German Americans were assaulted and even killed in some cases. And there's plenty of propaganda. This organization, the Committee on Public Information, they sought to strengthen support through propaganda, like what we have here on the right, which basically portrays the Germans as giant gorillas, right? And they're threatening mankind, or in this case, womankind in that art. And so this organization, they flooded the country with posters like this, with newspapers, with articles, with speeches, right? Um, if you wanted to see a movie or a play and you were alive at this time, you would actually see there would be men who would stand up in the audience and give 4-minute speeches promoting the war effort, trying to encourage people to support the war. And they portrayed enemies as brutes and animals, basically dehumanizing them. Meanwhile, women during World War One, women were very involved on the home front, but they also saw this as as a time to push for women's suffrage, the right to vote. And this was even endorsed by Woodrow Wilson late in 1916. Jeanette Rankin at this time also became the first congresswoman. In fact, her first vote as a congresswoman was to vote against the United States' entry into World War One. And fun fact, she also voted against our entry into World War II. She was like one of the only people to vote that way. So women were heavily involved in the war effort. They were nurses. They did work to raise money. The National Woman's Party, though, on the home front, was using militant tactics to try and get the United States to support women's suffrage across the country. And one of the leaders of this was a woman named Alice Paul, who said, just asking for the right to vote would not work. So she instead led efforts to get the right to vote by picketing the White House, by having hunger strikes in prison when women were arrested for picketing the White House. And they would picket at the White House with signs like this on the left. Notice it says Kaiser Wilson. Kaiser was the title given to the leader of Germany at this time. And so using a title like that for Wilson was basically calling him a dictator, not a duly elected president. And eventually, this movement succeeded. The 19th Amendment, which granted the right to vote to all women, was ratified in 1920. There's also this era saw an increase in support for prohibition. There's a surge in support due to World War I. Basically, because of the United States promoting nativism against immigrants who drank things like beer, like the Germans in particular. And so because of that, the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919, which prohibited the production, transportation, and use of alcohol in the United States. And this would last until 1933. Meanwhile, with the United States entering the war, there was a lot of questions about liberty and civil liberties, freedoms, right? And a lot of those were repressed during wartime, during World War I. There's widespread repression of civil liberties. There were laws passed like the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. And what this meant was that anybody who was critical of the government or anybody who was accused of interfering with the war effort faced possible fine or imprisonment. Both acts restricted speech and restricted the press in criticizing the war effort and the government in the war. And these laws and this repression of civil liberties mostly affected socialists, groups like the International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, and other laborers and foreign language publications. Eugene V. Debs, who was a leader of the Socialist Party, a leader who had been involved in many strikes. We learned about him a couple units back as well. He actually was imprisoned for violating these laws. And even while he was in prison, he ran for president. And here on the right, here's his campaign button while he was in prison. You can see it says convict number 9653. So there are also people who were patriotic, but they used that patriotism for some coercive, negative ways. You had neighbors who attacked neighbors who they deemed unpatriotic. And what we see is over 2,000 Americans prosecuted for violating one of these laws. We also had a group called the American Protective League, which is a volunteer group organized by the Justice Department that would basically rat out or sometimes physically assault people who were deemed undemocratic or unsupportive of the war effort. Immigrants to the United States were also pressured to assimilate, to become more quote-unquote American. Foreign things were prohibited, food, language, and music. If it wasn't considered quote-unquote American, it was prohibited or frowned upon. So, there's this question of, who is an American during this time period, even before the United States entered the war. There's something dubbed the race problem. Now, you might hear that and think, oh, we're talking about black and white issues. But it was actually far beyond that. And it came from this fear, really, of the white race losing power and losing numbers, an increase in fear of immigrants coming to the United States. And the race problem called for, it demanded actually, Americanization of immigrants. And it promoted the idea of the United States as this melting pot where people would come into the United States and kind of melt together and become one thing. Whatever the definition of American was, right? That's what they needed to become. And there's pressure on immigrants to Americanize their language, their clothes, their food, to give up their customs and languages that they came to the United States with, right? And to adopt American, whatever that means, culture. Germans in particular were targeted, of course, since the United States was fighting Germany in World War I. Immigration restrictions were enacted during this time period as well. The number of immigrants who are allowed to come from certain countries. Another thing, in fact, the first literacy tests for immigrants, so basically reading tests, were passed during this time, even though President Woodrow Wilson vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto and passed those literacy tests. This was also a time period that saw more attention being paid to the idea of eugenics, which we have talked about. And basically, if you don't remember, eugenics argued that states should be able to restrict the reproduction of certain people. And not surprisingly, a lot of people who were targeted by these eugenics laws were minority races, or they were immigrants, or they were poor, or disabled. And these laws were actually upheld by the Supreme Court. Latinos and Asian Americans were actually viewed separately from a lot of other immigrants, a lot of other immigrant groups, though. Even those, Latinos who were American were seen as separate, such as Puerto Ricans, for instance. They were finally were able to get American citizenship as a territory. However, they were still looked down upon and never really considered American during this time period. African Americans, meanwhile, had a very unique experience during World War I on the home front. This was an idea that was dubbed the color line. During the Progressive Era, when all these reforms were taking place, African Americans really didn't see many benefits from a lot of these progressive movements and reforms that we talked about in our last unit. So they were left out oftentimes intentionally. Segregation, in fact, was seen as natural by even many progressive leaders, and African Americans, as a result, they saw little to no support from the presidents of the United States, like Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. Wilson, in particular, when he became president, allowed for some aggressive policies. So even African Americans had seen, some growth of power and influence in the federal government before, and they quickly saw that disappear once Woodrow Wilson became president. However, this inspired African Americans to engage in protest. And this was led in large part by people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a professor. He was a professor who's the first African American to receive his PhD from Harvard University. He was very influential. And he resisted what were considered accommodationist ideas of Booker T. Washington. And he wanted and called for greater protests for African Americans to have political, civil, and economic rights, and didn't want them to have to wait for it. Du Bois and others helped form the Niagara Movement and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which you should have heard of by now from some of our previous lessons. And he actually supported, W.B. Du Bois supported U.S. entry into World War I, and saw it as an opportunity for Blacks to show unity with all Americans. They believed in the things that the United States was fighting for. That's what he wanted them to show. And that once the war was over and African Americans came back, that their bravery in the war, their contribution to the war, would show that they truly did deserve the same rights and the same power. However, the results were far less than what was hoped for. And we'll talk more about that in upcoming lessons and units. So at the same time, at home, there was something known as the Great Migration taking place. So because of the war and the need for supplies and the need for a lot of workers, particularly, because white men were being drafted and serving in the military, there was a demand for laborers in northern factories. And from 1910 to 1920, over 500,000 Blacks left the South for the North, something called a Great Migration from southern states to the North. And why did they do this? Well, they saw a chance for higher wages, a chance for more educational opportunities, and they had a desire for more rights than they believed they were getting in the South. And they were right. They were being deprived of many of their rights in the South. And for many of them, they did see higher pay. They saw better education. They saw safer neighborhoods in the North. However, there was conflict, a lot of racial conflicts when they moved into these cities, even in northern cities. There were several race riots. Racism and economic competition led to violence. There were lynchings. There were riots in the North and South. Hundreds of these riots took place and lynchings in the thousands over a span of about 70 years. Um, there also emerged the idea of Garveyism. These were based on the ideas of Marcus Garvey and his organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. Marcus Garvey, who was himself an immigrant, he supported national self-determination, just like other groups in Europe at the end of World War One were having the right of self-determination. And he wanted that for African Americans. And Garvey himself, he was deported, but he galvanized, he helped create a lot of energy and excitement in this idea about Black unity and their push for rights. Also, during this time, there was a major flu epidemic, particularly in the year 1918. And this was bad. It actually killed over 600,000 Americans. Over 30 million people were killed worldwide. This actually killed more people in the United States than the number who died and were even wounded in World War One, and killed more people worldwide than the actual World War One itself. And here's a photo of, an effect of the flu, the Spanish flu, where you had to close movie theaters. You had to close and stop churches from meeting. You had to close schools because of how dangerous and how quickly this flu spread. And it's kind of crazy to see the mask that this person is wearing in this photo and how eerily similar this scene looks to what we're going through today. So keep in mind that this was also going on throughout World War One and was, ravaging the United States at home as well as countries around the world. So that's going to be it for this lesson on the home front. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be sure to try to help you out.